Great. Thanks so much, Mary and Davis. And it's great to be here again. And thanks everyone for their attendance today. I hope it's been going well. We started with some introduction to climate storytelling and give you some guidance for creating your own climate stories. And then the focus of today's workshop is going to be interviewing. So building on some of the concepts we talked about in the first workshop about climate storytelling and the ingredients of that, and then broadening that to interviewing other people about their climate stories. Okay, so the plan for today, we'll start with an icebreaker question just to get into it. We'll do a check-in and see if you have any questions that have come up and we can answer those. Then we'll dive into interviewing. So we'll start out with a series of tips that help you set up your interviews, find your interviewee, carry out the interviews, record them. We'll have some time for partner practice, and then you'll just get to practice some of these skills we're giving you. And we'll come back and regroup as a group and just go over some takeaways from the meeting today. Okay, so let's start with this icebreaker question. I think we're all dealing with some challenging life situations, and obviously with climate change, we know that it's just very hard sometimes to adjust and to feel centered in these difficult times. So let's just throw it out there. Anyone wants to respond to the question of how do you recharge during challenging times? I mean, I'll say for me, probably like a lot of people, being outdoors is always my go-to activity. I love hiking. I live in Worcester, Massachusetts, and it's not like an outdoor mecca, but there are some pretty nice natural areas. So I hit up one of those. Try to do it every day. It's been really hard some weeks, but that's what I do. So anyone put anything in the chat? Davis, I like to take myself on a very long walk. I did so yesterday, even though it was super cold. I've been reading more novels as well. Awesome. How about you, Kelly?
Yeah, definitely. I've been taking walks ever since COVID started. I do at least one walk a day, which has been really helpful, just to get out of the house and get some sunshine, hopefully.
Yeah, good. All right, great. Well, why don't we forge ahead? So just to check in with you guys, I know we covered a lot last workshop about what's climate storytelling, why is it important. We gave you a framework for telling your own climate story with 3 prompts about tying climate change to your home place and what you care about there, emotional responses to climate change, and also ways to move forward in a positive direction and visions for a more positive future. So that was a structure we offered. As we said last time, you don't have to use that structure. Okay, well, just to throw it out there, we're always available. Kelly and I are always available to answer questions via email. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
For the workshop today, this is kind of an overview of what we'll talk about in terms of the actual interview process, sort of the step-by-step that you kind of go through when you're thinking about starting these climate story interviews. And the first step would be to think about and then contact potential interviewees. And when you're getting in touch with people, explaining the project, and we'll talk a little bit about informed consent, what that is and why that's so important to get. And once you've done this sort of preliminary work, you can go and conduct the interview. Make sure if it's a strictly audio interview that you ask for a photo of the person that you're speaking with. And then we'll also talk about, sharing the next steps with your interviewee and keeping in touch with them. So a lot of it is about communication as well. So the first step, finding somebody to interview about their climate story. We suggest that you start with the people closest to you and within your local network. So, family, friends, colleagues at work. And, you can also consider reaching out to people in community organizations that you might be a part of. So public libraries is a really great one, religious groups, any kind of community groups that you are a member of. You can, any way that you feel comfortable reaching out to people to ask if they'd like to participate. So email, Facebook, in person, phone call, however you would normally communicate with these people. I know When I first started doing the climate story interviewing, it was in the fall of 2020. So we weren't doing anything in person. So a lot of my interviewees I found via Facebook or by emailing people that I thought would be interested. So really, whatever works for you is a good way to go. And then I just like to put it out there that when you're asking people to do climate change interviewing or a climate change story, it's important to be aware and be prepared for them to say no, right? Um, I asked my father to do a climate change interview and he said no because he didn't think that it was such a big issue. Don't take it personally. It's not about you, but just be prepared that people might not want to do it. And the other thing I would say to be aware of is, and this has happened a lot of times where I've had people ask, why me? Why do you want to talk to me about climate change? And if you get that question, it helps, I think, to explain the project that we're looking for personal stories of climate change, because I've found, after kind of drawing people out a little bit about that question, a lot of that question stems from, well, I'm not an expert in climate change. I'm not a climate scientist. Why do you want to talk to me about that? Because a lot of times people conceptualize climate change as a scientific issue. But once they kind of hear that you're more interested in their personal thoughts and responses to climate change, then they kind of start to get it a little bit more. But it helped me to kind of like experience that firsthand and realize that, oh, this is something that people aren't necessarily thinking about the same way I am. And then the interviews can take place in person or remotely. And again, I would say most of my interviews have been done remotely up until about last summer. I did some in-person interviews. So whatever you are comfortable with and whatever your interviewee is comfortable with is the best way to go. And, as you are finding your interviewees and explaining the project to them, something that you're going to absolutely need to get is informed consent. And this is really important because you want the person that you're speaking with to understand what the interview is about, why you're collecting the information, and how it will be used so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to participate. So again, you want to explain who you are, give your contact information, explain the scope of the project and the goals of the project. So if you are, let's say, conducting some interviews to submit to Climate Stories Project, you could point them to the website and you could say, this organization is collecting personal climate change stories, and this is how they use them on the website. They provide a photograph and an excerpt of the audio interview. And again, it's all about giving the person the information so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to participate. Again, what are you going to do with the interview material? When you are actually going to record, it's really important to, again, ask permission right before you hit record. Ask permission to record, edit, and share the interview. Consent is an ongoing process, right? So you want to get informed consent to begin the process of the interview, and you want to continue to get consent throughout the interview. The easiest way to do this is to get verbal consent, and we have a submission form on our website under the Share Your Climate Story tab at the top of our website. And if we have time, Jason, maybe we can show.
Is it okay if I just quickly show that right now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So here's climatestoriesproject.org. A reminder that that's just the website link. And this has changed a little bit since probably maybe when these slides were created. So what you want to do is go to Share a Story tab up here. Okay. So if you're doing your own climate story, you're submitting your own story, it's Share Your Climate Story here. If you're doing an interview, it's just right down here, Share a Climate Story Interview. So this is the go-to place. It has some suggested questions. We can get to that some more later today. There's some documents that'll help you with the interview and the process, interviewing tips. So what you need to do is both put your name in as the interviewer in this first section. These red stars are required. You don't have to put your phone number if you don't want to, today's date, and then below that, you need to get the name of the interviewee's email address, where they live, etc. And this is the important part. They have to give official permission on this website. You can do this verbally. So if you're doing, say, a remote interview, you just go over the items on this page and you check the box. My interviewee grants permission for their story to be edited and shared. Keep in mind, though, like this is the process of interviewing is really important. So if the interviewee just says, no, I don't want to share this, it's still valuable to do the interview. Okay, so in that case, you can just say my interviewee does not grant permission for the story to be edited and shared, and it won't go on the website, clearly. If you're interviewing someone like a child under the age of 18, it's really important that they get parental consent to do that. So you have to make sure that they've done that, and then they would check this third, or you would check this third selection. Here's where you also upload the files, and we'll talk about recording in a sec. Here you can upload an audio file. If you're doing a video interview, best to contact us, and we can share a link that'll help, or a folder that'll help you upload those. And here's where you upload a photo. So once you've got your audio interview, the photo of the interviewee goes with that. Okay, so then any other comments and instructions. So again, it's the climatestoriesproject.org website, share a story, and share a climate story interview.
Thanks, Jason. Okay. And then just the final thing that you want to discuss with your interviewee is share how and when their interview will appear on the website online, because they'll probably want to go and see it, right? And again, it's a process. It's something that you can do throughout the interview and even after the interview as well. Well, anyway, the last thing I wanted to mention too is with the informed consent, please make sure that your interviewee knows that it is okay to withdraw from the interview, from the project. If they, it's their choice, it's their story, it's their choice. If you record a beautiful interview with someone and you're very excited to share it, and then at the end they say, wait, I changed my mind, I don't want to, that's their prerogative. And it's something that we really have to respect in terms of being an interviewer in that way. So now, just some kind of tips for the actual interview itself. You want to kind of agree beforehand on a quiet place and time to conduct the interview. Try to, minimize distractions and background noises. It might seem really atmospheric to record a climate interview on a beach somewhere, but the waves coming in would definitely be an auditory distraction just in terms of hearing their voice. So just pay attention to stuff like that. Usually we say budget about an hour for the interview in terms of getting set up, getting comfortable in the interview process, and then, closing out the interview. You're not necessarily going to be actually interviewing for an entire hour. Of course you could be, but just, be aware of the person's time and be respectful of that. So kind of let them know how long you expect things to take. When you get there, and, even before you get there, and Jason will talk a little bit more about this towards the end of today, know your recording equipment and, set up your recording equipment. If you're using that, you might just be using your phone, but if you have any specialized microphone or anything like that, set it up and test it. Make sure you do a sound test. It's the worst feeling in the world to record an interview and then get back and realize that it didn't take. And that has happened to me, unfortunately. You want to, very first thing, ask your interviewee to introduce themselves on the recording. And that just kind of, it gives an intro to what you're going to talk about. And throughout, aim for a conversational tone. You don't want to interrogate people about their thoughts and feelings about climate change. You want it to be a conversation. And, feel free to talk to the person, to include your own observations as well, because that'll definitely help that conversation flow. You can use phrases like "tell me more." So, sometimes people feel a little bit self-conscious about doing interviews, and if you're able to kind of really listen to what they're saying and use these kind of, can you tell me more about that, or ask follow-up questions. So somebody might say something really interesting, and you can ask follow-up questions to get them to talk more about it.
Yeah, just to give a couple examples, I mean, so I've done a lot of interviewing in all sorts of different places. Like Kelly said, a lot of it has been online, so it's not as much of an issue. But a lot of times you want to meet somewhere like a public place, like a coffee shop, and I found that's like the absolute worst place to do an interview. There's always noises. There's the espresso machine. There's people talking. So it's surprising how much other sounds can get into the recording. I have found sometimes the outdoor interviews can be nice if it's not too loud. And I'll talk about what you need to think about if you're doing an outdoor recording, but certainly more quiet is better than louder. And the issue about follow-up questions is really important. So especially with some of the things we talked about last time with sensory details and emotions, very often it's hard for people to talk about climate change in this personal way. So very often I'll ask them if they describe a flood, say that they experienced in their community. I really want to know what that flood felt like and what they observe on the ground, and be really specific. So sometimes you have to dig under the surface and ask ask follow-up questions to get the interviewee to open up a bit more and to really get out some of these interesting details.
Some more interview tips. As you're having the conversation with your interviewee, it's really important and very difficult sometimes to focus on actually listening and not on what you'll ask next. And one way that I personally have found to kind of combat this fear of forgetting to ask something, right? You have this idea that you're doing this interview and you need to get to everything, and what if you forget? So you're just focused on that. But whereas you really want to be listening to what the person is actually saying. It can be very helpful to write down your questions so you don't forget them. And you can, as I think Jason mentioned earlier, use the prompt questions that we introduced last time, or you can make up your own. I always, when I'm doing interviews, I will use the prompt questions and I will sprinkle in some of my own as well. And again, this is where the listening comes in, right? So if somebody is saying something, you can certainly on the fly kind of create these follow-up questions based on what they're saying, as it makes sense in the interview. Again, you also want to encourage that personal response. So what are they thinking and feeling about climate change? And like Jason just mentioned, the follow-up questions can be good for that. So encouraging the I statements, getting or asking people like, what do you remember about that? So they're kind of prepped and primed to say, I remember X, Y, Z. Again, the specific sensory details. And for example, like Jason mentioned, the flood. So you might, or a flood, you might ask something like, well, did the river have a particular smell? What did the river sound like? Or what color was the water? You can get really specific. And I've found that when you ask these specific questions, a lot of times, someone will answer them, and then it'll also trigger all these other things that they wanted to say. So they'll just keep going, which is fantastic. And then when you're done with the interview, I always like to ask at the end, do you have anything else to add? So that they have a chance to say more if they would like to. And really, really, really important, do not stop recording until your meeting is over. again, doing an interview might not be something that someone does every day. So they might be nervous. And, as soon as you say, okay, the interview's over, turn off the recording, and then they talk more. And this has happened to me many times. Actually, the last time it happened to me was last summer. I was recording a family friend, and she was very nervous to do the interview. And I asked if she had anything else to add. She said no. So I was like, okay, we're done. I turned off my recorder. And then, a couple minutes later, she started talking about dredging that was taking place in a river nearby, and how dead crabs were washing up on the beaches. And I had to say, wait, stop talking. Is it okay if I keep recording? And then I turned on my recorder again. So it's just, really make sure that they're done, and don't be afraid to ask if you can keep recording. If they say no, obviously don't, but, just be aware that that can happen. When you're finished interviewing, make sure to thank the interviewee and explain the next steps of the process. And this is, again, when and where they can find and see their shared interview if they chose to share it, and also how they can withdraw from the project. And this is really important on both of these things. Make sure that they have your contact information and you have theirs, because again, this is related to that informed consent, which is ongoing. So even a year or two from now, if they say, I don't want this up here anymore, it's important for them to be able to get in contact with somebody, or for you to get in contact with them so they can take it down.
But why don't we do just like a really quick sample for people?
Okay.
I can interview you.
Okay. Sounds
Yeah,
good.
yeah, just to give people a sense for how this could look. Obviously it's going to take a lot longer, but let's just pretend, I'm meeting you, say, in a quiet area. Maybe it's a meeting room in a library or a quiet park or something like that. So I would arrive with plenty of time. I would set up, say I'm using a camera or an audio recorder, and make sure that's working. Maybe, okay, Kelly arrives, and then I asked her, okay, Kelly, great to see you today. So just to remind you about Climate Stories Project, the goal of the project is to hear people's personal stories about climate change. So we're really interested in hearing your perspective, your emotional responses, and really what we want to do is to make climate change a topic of everyday conversation and something people are comfortable talking with. So we know it can be a little strange to talk about climate change in this personal way, but really that's what we want to hear. So are you ready to start the interview?
Sure.
Great. So first, I just want to make sure that you're aware that I'm going to be recording the interview, and I need to ask for your consent to do the interview and the recording. You will be able to withdraw from the process at any time. So if we finish the interview and then you feel like you don't want to have the interview be shared, that's perfectly acceptable. So at this point, I would say maybe I have my phone there, and I would go through that share your interview form with Kelly and get her information, and then just get her consent. And that could be done previous to the interview as well. Okay, so you ready to start recording, Kelly?
Yes, sounds good.
Great. So first, I just love if you can introduce yourself, and tell us where you're from, or tell me where you're from, and a little bit about your connection to your home place.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Kelly Hydrick, and I currently live in Worcester, Massachusetts with my family. I've lived here for about 8 years, and yeah, I think my connection with this place relates a lot to the sort of wildlife I see in my backyard. We planted a garden, and I've planted bulbs throughout the years, so I like to see them come up, and the birds. And we had a local pheasant that came to the neighborhood for a while. So I'm really interested in speaking about climate change. How climate change kind of affects what I see, wildlife wise,
Mhm.
in my neighborhood.
Could you give a specific example of that?
Um, well, the one that I always like to give is when I was growing up, I actually grew up in Pennsylvania, in a very similar type of, suburban neighborhood. There were bees all over the ground, all over the place, just bees everywhere. And you couldn't walk sometimes because of all the bees. You had to watch out for the stings, of course, right? And I really reflect on that a lot because I don't see bees like that anymore. I'll see maybe one or two every summer. And I have two young boys, and every time I see a bee, I'll point it out to them like, look, this is a bee, right? Because they don't see them like I used to. And that can make me really sad because it's just something that they're so unfamiliar with. And I find them that they're more afraid of when they do see a bee. It's not a normal thing for them.
Great. So, Kelly's kind of a pro at this, so she kind of naturally related some anecdotes and some of her emotional responses. So, that may not be your experience with your interviews. So, just that follow-up question is really important. Those follow-up questions are really important to draw out some of those details, sensory details, emotions, etc. So we'll say we're done with the interview. I would say thank you, Kelly. That's great. I really appreciate your time. Um, and so we're going to be listening to these. We may do some editing, and that usually means just shortening the interview. So what we post is typically like a 2 or 3 minute interview. So just so everyone knows that your interview might go on for half an hour, but we're not going to share that full half an hour. And editing is not required for this process. So, but just so your interviewee knows that there's a good chance that it could be shortened and condensed in a bit. So just to remind you, you can withdraw from the project if you would like. If you don't feel comfortable sharing it, that's totally fine. Just get in touch with me and say, here's my contact information, here's my email. Make sure you have your interviewee's email. And don't forget, say, hey, this is an audio interview. We really want to share your photograph as well. So is it okay if I take your picture? Or if they don't want to do that, then you could ask them to email you their photograph at a later time. And you can expect, assuming all this goes according to plan, you can expect to see your interview on the website maybe in roughly 2 weeks or so. Okay, so that's a really short example, but that's a good way to approach these interviews.
And Jason, I just wanted to mention too that regarding the photographs, I know some people feel uncomfortable about sharing their photos online. So I've had people send, like pictures of their garden, or something that they talk about in their interview, and that's completely fine too.
Yeah, I mean it's really about their connection to their home place that can work. You just want to give the control to the interviewee and make sure they're comfortable with the steps in the process, and whatever they share is they feel comfortable and good about sharing. Great, yeah. So why don't we take a few minutes? I don't know if Davis and Mary, you guys want to do some practice, but we could have you guys just practice this process with the prompts or whatever works for you.
I think that could work. Or like I could just practice, and I'd be happy to be interviewer with one of you guys.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so how about I ask Jason this time, because Kelly just did some, and I'm going to pretend like, and Jason can pretend like you've never done this before.
Oh man.
Be difficult.
Take it away.
Okay, so, well, the consent, we're going to pretend like we did consent, and we're just going to jump into things. So, yeah, can you tell me a little bit about introduce yourself? Tell me who you are and where you're at.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'm Jason. I live in Massachusetts.
We're in Massachusetts.
I'm in Worcester, Massachusetts.
And what do you like about living in Worcester?
Well, like there's some interesting bars here. I work here, so sometimes I'm not really connected that connected to here. So,
how long have you lived there?
It's been about 3 years now.
Oh, so it's pretty new. Is there anything that you do that connects you to Worcester? Is there, besides working there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I have to think a little bit, but I do love being outdoors. So there are some nice parks here. I live right on a lake, which is nice.
You live right on a lake. That's amazing.
Yeah,
What is it like there?
it's great. I can see it right now, and it's. I think what I like about the lake is it changes so much. So some days it's really today's very very calm. Other days it's extremely rough, and it's a really good window on what's going out there in the natural world.
And if you've been there for 3 years, what kind of things have you noticed that have changed in the last 3 years about this lake?
Mhm. Well, I haven't lived here for that long. Actually, this I should have prefaced that I've only lived in this apartment for a few months, so
Oh,
and
okay.
I've also been in other places. Anyway, story gets too long, but certainly, I'll just jump out of character here. Like Mary could ask about where else have you lived? If it's only say a few months, and maybe she could ask, what about where you grew up? So very often people have a very strong connection to their place they spent their childhood if it's different than where they're living currently. So as an interviewer, if you find that they don't have a lot to talk about, say with the current place they are, well, you can ask about, well, what about your hometown when you were a child? And very often that sparks a lot of memories and a lot of anecdotes, and maybe a longer time frame, so people can reflect more on the changes they've observed.
Cool. So can you tell me a little bit about where you grew up?
Mhm. Sure. So I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, not that far from here. And I certainly remember things being different with the weather when I was growing up. The winters were a lot consistently colder. So nowadays we'll have very cold weather, but then it'll very often break, and it'll be say 60 degrees in January or February, and it'll get cold again. So one of my strongest memories is ice skating. And I lived pretty near Walden Pond, which is where Henry David Thoreau did his famous sojourn away from civilization, at least back in the 1840s. And we used to ice skate with my family, and like the ice was super thick, and you could really feel like, 2, sometimes 3 feet thick. It looked super solid. And I can't remember now the last time it's froze like that. It'll freeze sometimes, but very thin, and then it'll melt shortly thereafter that. And so I feel sad about that. I feel like I lost a piece of what I grew up with. So
Yeah.
great. So that was good on Mary's part to dig a little bit and find another angle that we can talk about.
I guess then the harder part is the harder part then is like how do you ask these more difficult questions about climate change?
Yeah, it's not always easy depending on your interviewee. I mean, I've interviewed like climate activists, and they're just ready to go. They have the story planned out. I mean, not necessarily planned out, but they've been thinking about it. They're really engaged already, so they naturally have a lot to talk about. Other people will just be a lot more hesitant, and that's fine too. So you don't want to be too aggressive. And also, in any interview, you have to be a little bit careful about leading the interviewee. And so sometimes people want to say please you, or say what they think you want them to hear. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. If some people are just feeling like that's where they want to leave things, that's fine too. There's no required outcome for these living but I think that what we just did of like pivoting a little bit, say from talking about Worcester, where I've only been a little bit living a short period of time, to my hometown where I grew up as a child, can be really effective. And I obviously done this a lot, so I kind of naturally went into detail. But Mary could have asked, well, give me a specific story you remember of growing up that reflects, say, the way that the climate has changed. So it's really about those specific examples that people can dig into, and that makes the story come alive, and those sensory details. So what did it look? What did the pond look like? What did it feel like to be out there on the ice?
Yeah. I just wanted to say one more thing too about the how do you get people to talk about confronting climate change. I find I like to ask the question, what made you want to sit down and talk about this today? That can be a good question to ask too, because people have a reason for saying, yes, I'll do the interview. And it can be helpful to kind of hear about that as well.
Mhm. Yeah, motivation is very important. So we didn't really get in our sample interviews, what do you envision as a more positive future? What do you see as a role you can play in making that come forward? So we have this prompt structure, which I do think works pretty well. You can go off that. I've done interviews where the person really wanted to talk about their dog, and it just that was they really wanted to talk about their dog for a while, and maybe you have to let that play out. And as an interviewer, it's a delicate balance of letting the interviewee talk about stuff and steering things back to say climate change. I tend to err more on the side of letting the interviewee talk about what they care about, and it's not always about climate change per se. I've done a lot of interviews with people that want to talk about litter, and or water or air pollution, and in my opinion, that's okay. It's all connected, and as long as you're getting the interviewee to talk about their connection to the environment and why they care about it, that's valid. So um, as long as it's personal and not just abstract, I always try to steer it back towards the personal experience, emotions, personal observations. So. Great. So just a few words about recording. This also takes some practice. So there's simple and complicated ways to do this. The easiest way is just to use your smartphone. I mean, every phone, of course, can record audio and video quite easily. But you even with your phone, sometimes it does take some practice in, say, getting good sound. So you want to make sure you know some of the options in there. How do you set up your phone is very important. Perhaps a really important thing to keep in mind for a video interview is to always have your phone in the horizontal position. Also unnatural because we're used to recording things vertically. But when you go to look at that, it won't fill a screen properly. We have those black bars on the side. So always put your phone vertical. Much better to use a tripod. If you don't have that, you could have a friend, say, hold the phone as steady as they can, so you're not stressing out about holding the phone. If it's an audio interview and say you're around a table, it's pretty simple. You can just stick the phone pretty close to the interviewee. Closer is usually better. So usually the problem comes with too quiet and you get too much extraneous noise. If it's really close, it could overload the signal and you get some distortion. But lots of other tools you can use. This is a Zoom recorder. I've used these things for decades now, so this will get you usually a little bit better sound quality than the phone recorder. It does take more time to get used to this thing. So if you are going to go this route, you do have to play with this and practice and get set up. It has batteries, so you have to make sure those are charged up. It has a memory card, which I have to make sure has enough space on it. Depending on what you're doing, you might have extra cables or connections, and practice. I've made every mistake you could possibly make with this kind of stuff. So just be aware of that. It's actually really nice to have a backup. So if you can record, say, with a Zoom recorder, if you have that and your phone, you're more likely to get something that works well. So I'm afraid I said a lot of these already, but tripods are super helpful if you can invest in that or borrow one. There's attachments for phones, so you can get these little clip kind of things where it screws right into the top of the tripod. As we mentioned, I was recording landscape mode with the phone, horizontal mode. Make sure you're in a quiet environment. If you're doing an outdoor recording, it's very important to use a windscreen. That's just a little foam piece that would go on the top of the Zoom recorder. Wind can be very loud, even if it doesn't feel like it's going to be. So this will cut down on the wind noise quite a bit. You want to be close. So if you're too far away with the recorder, the sound usually will not be as good. Do a sound check or a video check. So I always have the person introduce themselves for just like 30 seconds. Say, okay, let me just check it out. You have your headphones there, or maybe you can just hear it through the speaker. Make sure the sound is coming through okay. Make sure the video looks okay. And just don't forget to take a photograph or have the person send you a photograph after the interview if it's just audio. There's tons of stuff we can talk about here. We have some more tips on our website, and there's endless YouTube videos about recording interviews. So. And important point, editing the interview is definitely optional, and this could be a big ask for people. So if you're not comfortable with this, don't worry. you can just send in or submit, say, your 30-minute audio interview or video interview, and then we'll take care of the editing. If you are interested, please let me know, and we can talk about some more tools for editing audio or video. All right, so coming to the end, yeah. So next steps. If you haven't yet, just finish working on your own climate story. Some of the stuff you covered in that first workshop, and recording that and sharing that if you feel comfortable, and start setting up your interviews. So start thinking about who you want to interview, where you can interview them, some contact with them about how it's going to go. Scheduling can be a little tricky. And then go for it. You know, carry out your interviews, record them, share them, and we're always here to answer questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Final workshop in the series is working through emotions and trauma-informed interviewing, and that'll be on April 28th of this year, and we'll have just some time to debrief and chat about the process. Right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.